Hey guys, and welcome to another game review. Today's game that I will be reviewing is Need for Speed Underground 2. Need for Speed Underground 2 was released in 2004, and its platforms have been PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and PC. I also want to note that all of the gameplay clips in this video were recorded by me during my playthrough for this review. So without further ado, let's get into the review. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is story. And this game started off pretty good with its story. This game picks up right after Need for Speed Underground 1, where after defeating Eddie, you're going to go to a party to celebrate. But on your way to the party, a guy with a Psy tattoo on the back of his hand and a Hummer rams you and totals your car, and I'm pretty sure almost kills you. So after that you decide to leave town and go to the city, where in the city you meet the character Rachel, who, and honestly this is to me whenever this game's story started going downhill, the character Rachel is going to be your manager. I've never really heard of street racers having managers. That to me just didn't really make any sense. But anyway, she's your manager, and she finds you races, and the other thing that didn't make sense is that she finds you sponsors. Like, sponsors from legal car part manufacturers. That makes absolutely no sense. Why would legal car part manufacturers be sponsoring an illegal street racer? Like, that makes absolutely no sense. And you also end up on the covers of magazines and CDs. Yet again, made no sense why an illegal street racer would be ending up on the covers of legal magazines and legal CDs. That just didn't make any sense to me. But anyways, you continue through the game, racing, and you encounter the guy with the Psy tattoo on his hand again. And I don't actually know if I don't actually remember if his name is ever, revealed to you. I mean, honestly, I just didn't really care what his name was. But anyway, Psy Tattoo Guy. You encounter Psy Tattoo Guy multiple times throughout the game, and he's basically paying people off to beat you in street races. But since you keep winning the street races, people kind of start, not taking money from him. They start moving away from him, and he's losing basically all of his support. So, at the end of the game, he gets a call from his boss. And his boss is never actually revealed. You never find out who his boss is in this game or any of the Need for Speed games. But I've always kind of assumed that his boss is probably Darius, who is the main antagonist of Need for Speed Carbon. But that is never actually verified in any of the games. That is just a theory, a game theory. So, yeah, then he smashes his phone and challenges you to a race. And I honestly have always thought that this was so stupid, the final race of the game, because he had a Hummer. He had a Humvee. And Need for Speed has always been known for their iconic boss cars. I mean, just look at Need for Speed Most Wanted with that blue and white BMW. That thing is iconic. So I thought I was going to be racing the Hummer, and the Hummer would have been a very iconic car, and it would have made sense with the story of the game, because in all the cutscenes he has a Humvee. But then in the final race, he has a Pontiac GTO that I don't even remember what the thing looked like. I think it was gray. It was gray. And I'm pretty sure it had like a random generated decal on the side. It was just really lame. But anyways, you beat him and everybody's happy. Yay, whatever. This game's story really wasn't that good. But I gotta give it some credit for, basically having a story at all. Because racing games don't usually have much of stories, and they don't usually have the greatest story, so I'm not really comparing this game to poetry. But anyways, I'm going to have to give this game for story a score of 4 out of 10. This game gets a 4 out of 10 for story. That is a bad score. The only reason I'm not going to give it a score lower, honestly, is because, honestly, this game's not really overly story-driven. This game's more about the racing. The story doesn't really need to drive you to beat the game. Alright, so the next thing I want to talk about is graphics. And to be honest, this was probably the best part of this game. Because for 2004, there were not many games that looked better than this game did. Though I wouldn't say it was one of the best looking games of its time, but it definitely was a very good looking game. I mean, just first of all, look at the scenery. There's so much detail in the scenery. If you look at the cityscapes, they all have a lot of nice details. There's also some very memorable looking areas, such as the casino area. That looked really good. I thought that the canyon area looked quite nice, and there wasn't, like, in the backdrops and stuff, like the background of the game. The background, actually, of this game looked very good, which is surprising because games back then didn't really care about the background scenery, but this game actually looked quite good. And I would have to say easily the best part of this game's graphics was the cars, and a racing game should have good looking cars, and this game really did have good looking cars. I mean, just look at, like, my Mustang, for instance. My Mustang looked really good. It actually looked very, very realistic for 2004. I mean, that thing looked like a Mustang. The paint was nice and shiny and metallic-y. The windows looked really good. The wheels looked great. I mean, just everything about the car looked very good, very smooth, and very well-rounded. Or my Toyota Corolla. My Corolla looked quite good, I thought. And then something else that was a little bit different about this game graphically compared to most games was its cutscenes. It had, like, comic book style cutscenes, which I know they weren't necessarily the most action-packed cutscenes or necessarily the most visually impressive, but it looked a lot better than when Need for Speed tries to do animated people. Because let me tell you, if you've played Need for Speed games, you've probably noticed they can't animate people. I mean, the Need for Speed games that had real live-action cutscenes, of course, looked pretty good because they weren't animated. But look at the people in Need for Speed Underground 1. I mean, those people looked like aliens. Or look at the people in, actually, even the newer Need for Speed games. Look at Need for Speed Heat. The people in that game looked awful. And their movements were all, like, mechanical and robotic and just terrible looking, honestly. But I really did like this game's, like, comic book style cutscenes. I thought that was very smart of them. So, I'm going to have to give this game, for graphics, a score of 9 out of 10. That is a great score. The only reason I wouldn't give it a 10 is because I do believe there were games at that time that did have slightly better graphics, but this game's graphics were definitely great. Alright, so the third thing I want to talk about is gameplay. And when I'm doing my reviews, gameplay is the main thing I take into consideration when coming up with my final scores. And I thought this gameplay was very good, honestly. First, let's talk about the good things. And probably the best thing in this game was the car modifying. The car modifying this game was great. I mean, from the way that you could fine-tune the performance upgrades of your car to your liking, you could customize the body parts of your car, you could do, like, cool custom stuff like underglow and things like that, and custom, doors and stuff. You could also get into some really nice decal work and paint work to make your car look very unique and very nice. I thought that was really good. This game also had a very good selection of cars, a good mix of tuner cars, muscle cars, and it also had a good selection of SUVs. Though I will say I wish there were more SUVs because there are actually only 3 SUVs in this game. Literally, 3 SUVs, that's it. There's a Lincoln, a Cadillac, and the Hummer. That's all of the SUVs in this game. There could have been more. But there wasn't really a need for more SUVs, honestly. And then it also had a pretty good selection of different races. I mean, you had your sprint races and point-to-point races, which were your standard races. You had Street X, which were on like these really like tight technical tracks, which I wish honestly races like those were in more Need for Speed games, but they were basically only in this Need for Speed game, so I wish they would have done more of those. Then you have the drift races, which were probably the only races in this game that I didn't really care for, just because the drifting mechanics were kind of weird. But honestly, for 2004, you couldn't expect much from drifting. Then you had drag racing, which I thought the drag racing was pretty good, but it's kind of hard to get drag racing wrong. It's pretty basic. Then you had the URL races, which were on tracks basically inspired by like real race tracks. I thought that was a pretty cool idea. Then you have the outrun races, where basically you find a car and basically initiate a race with them, and you have to get 1,000 feet ahead of them and you win, or if you fall behind 1,000 feet, you lose. I thought those were pretty neat. And then you had SUV races, which I thought the SUV races were a really smart idea, because the SUVs couldn't really compete with the other cars very well because, well, they don't handle well at all. They handle horribly. So they would have been like really underpowered against like the other cars in the game. So it was really smart for them to have separate races for the SUVs. But that's all the different races. It was a pretty good selection of races. And also I want to note that this was the first Need for Speed game to have an open world. It had a free roam world. And it didn't just have a free roam world, it had a great one. Honestly, this is one of the best open worlds in any racing game I have ever played. It was just really, really good, and it was really big too. I mean, this place was massive. The only part of the world that I didn't really care for was the canyon, honestly. But other than that, I thought that the open world was really good. Now, the parts of this gameplay that I didn't like. First of all, you couldn't teleport. You had to drive to every single race, which at first is fun and all, but pretty quickly that starts getting really annoying that you have to drive to every race. And if there's a race, for instance, up in the canyon, it's going to take forever to drive to that race, and it's just like really, really annoying. It just felt like basically a way to make the game longer. Another complaint I would have is this game has like no bosses other than the final boss, which didn't even feel like a boss, which I found kind of surprising because I've always thought Need for Speed games were kind of known for their iconic boss races, and this game just had no iconic boss races whatsoever. Another complaint that I would have, and this is probably my biggest complaint about this game's gameplay, is its lack of difficulty curve. There's absolutely no difficulty curve whatsoever. It really feels like from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, it stays at one level of difficulty through the entire game. It doesn't get any harder. If anything, I would actually have to say the beginning of the game was harder than the end of the game, because some of the earlier races I would struggle with like maybe a little bit, but then the later races I just won those things with just with ease. Honestly, they were so easy. There's like no difficulty curve. But all in all, I thought that this game was very fun, and it had very good, solid gameplay, honestly. You know, especially with the open world. I would say that was probably the biggest thing this game had going for it. So for gameplay, I'm going to have to give this game a score of 7 out of 10. That is a good score, because I did think that this game's gameplay was good. Now, just two more things I want to talk about before giving you all the final score for this game. And the first of those two things is difficulty. I found this game to be, honestly, very easy. Like, I found it to be pretty easy, and as I said before, there's absolutely no difficulty curve. It just kind of stayed on one level of easy throughout the entire game. The only thing that I would say that I actually struggled with at all was the drift races. Those were the only races that I actually lost a couple of. But everything else in this game, I kind of just won. I think I might have lost in a couple of drag races, but I basically just won every race that I entered. So I'm going to have to give this game for difficulty a 4 out of 10. It was quite easy, honestly. This game was, I would say it was an easy game. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before giving you all the final score is playthrough length. And this game's a doozy, honestly, because Need for Speed games are usually fairly short. They usually range somewhere around, I would say, 10 hours for just completing the main story, and that's what I did with this. This wasn't 100% playthrough. This was just completing the main campaign. To complete the main campaign, this game took me a total of 21 hours, making this the longest, honestly, of all of the Need for Speed games I've ever played, because I've beat every other Need for Speed somewhere around the 10-hour or less mark. So this was actually quite a long game. Now it is time to give you all the final score for this game. And this game's final score is 7 out of 10. I thought this game was good. It could have been better, it could have, gotten a little harder at the end of the game. It could have had more iconic bosses. It could have had more of some things. But it did have very, very solid car customizing and a very good car, selection. And it also had a massive, well-designed free roam world. And I did find it to be a very fun game to play. So, thanks for watching, and make sure to sub, like, and comment below.